Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. I'm just gonna talk a little bit today about the work that Milwaukee Riverkeeper has done around road salt and really focusing in on our monitoring program, outreach and education efforts, as well as some policy change. So just really quickly, for folks who aren't familiar with Milwaukee Riverkeeper, we're a nonprofit organization. We started in 1995, and our mission really is to protect water quality and wildlife habitat in the Milwaukee River Basin, which also includes the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers as they come together in downtown Milwaukee and discharge to Lake Michigan. But we call ourselves a science-based advocacy organization, and we're really working for clean, fishable, swimmable, drinkable water. And we work in 4 different kind of buckets of work. One is kind of protection efforts, restoration efforts, connecting people with the water, and also advocacy. And so we'll probably touch on a couple of those today. So this is a map of the Milwaukee River Basin. We're in southeastern Wisconsin here. Our basin drains into Lake Michigan, and it's around 882 square miles. Starting kind of up in Fond du Lac and Dodge in Sheboygan counties, and then moving down eventually to Milwaukee County, where it discharges into the lake. We have about 1.3 million people that live in the watershed, and there's around 500 miles of perennial streams, and then another 400 or so of intermittent and ephemeral streams. And we have kind of a mix of land use. There certainly the Menominee and Kinnickinnic are incredibly urban watersheds, but if you take the whole area as a whole, kind of a good mix of land use there. When the Milwaukee River Basin, the Milwaukee River watershed still fairly rural. So road salt and chloride, I think I only have 1 or 2 slides on this, but I think everyone hopefully knows that road salt's used very commonly here. We've seen the use of it actually exponentially increase since the 50s. And it's applied, in winter months to roadways, driveways, parking lots. And, the big problem is really the polluted runoff that carries a lot of water polluted with road salt and other pollutants, often into storm drains and eventually into our rivers. And that, we're seeing that there's some major impacts on water quality and aquatic life from road salt. So just really quickly, and I know a lot of folks know all of this, but it's very damaging to vehicles and infrastructure, bridges, roadways, obviously harmful to pets, but also to wildlife. And certainly we are, concerned about fish and mussels and other aquatic life. But there's also been, very interesting studies looking at impacts to amphibians and other wildlife as well. It's also damaging to a lot of soil and plant life, especially those that are adjacent to our roadways. And many of our plants really can't take that salt. And I think probably maybe folks have experienced even at your own house, plants can get very damaged by winter salting. But, it's very toxic to freshwater fish and aquatic organisms. And we know, in a river environment, the chloride concentrations increase, it essentially desiccates our organisms. So that water kind of will leave the organisms to kind of create a balance. And so that can also, lead to a lot of stress, dehydration, and harm to aquatic life and potentially even death if you had a really, significant concentration of chloride. So when we talk about chloride, and this is going to start getting a little bit wonky, but hopefully bear with me. There's 2 different types of toxicity that we look at in Wisconsin. And one is kind of a chronic toxicity. So this might be, a slightly elevated level of chloride that, if it was very short period of time, maybe wouldn't be a big deal. But even at those elevated levels that maybe aren't, incredibly high, often, if you have those higher levels over a period of time, and in Wisconsin, the standards look at 4 days, those kind of elevated levels over a sustained period of time can cause stress to organisms, cause harm, and potentially even death. And then we also look at, and that's in Wisconsin, 395 to 756 milligrams per liter of chloride. No test on that anyway. So then there's also acute toxicity, which essentially is looking at those very high chloride levels, which we know can result, in some cases to instant death to fish and other aquatic organisms. And so that level with our state standards is greater than or equal to 757 milligrams per liter of chloride. And so we started our program kind of going back a little bit with some history around 2010, really as a pilot project with DNR and also USGS. And we, for folks that know, we started having conversations with Steve Corsi at USGS and also Chris Stepanuk at the time, who was managing our Water Action Volunteers program for DNR and Extension. And, really talking about starting to do citizen science around chloride, which isn't something that the WAVE program had looked at previously. And I think there was a sense that USGS was being, pulled in many directions, and that they weren't going to be able to continue a lot of real seminal research that they had done in the Milwaukee area on road salt and the impacts on our streams. And in particular, they had done a lot of really extensive monitoring of several of our smaller creeks that drained the interstate, the I-94, that were incredibly and remain so today, very highly impaired by chloride and runoff from the highway system. And in particular, Honey Creek and Underwood Creek, if there are any locals on the line here. But, there was a sense that we really wanted to continue this monitoring and that we really didn't know a whole lot about the chloride and levels in a lot of our streams, especially a lot of the smaller streams. So we started, I went back and looked the other day, it was 30 different sites, mostly in the greater Milwaukee area. We also did some monitoring at that time of the Root River and Oak Creek as well. And there were quite a lot of sites also in the Madison kind of Yahara area. But we kind of started looking really at that smaller level of sites and doing chloride testing and also conductivity testing. And just trying to come up with, what the relationship was and trying to figure out what our protocol should be. And that has led to, I think, a pretty robust program now where I believe there's dozens of groups in the state that are doing this kind of winter road salt monitoring with community volunteers. So we generally go out from January to April, and we have our volunteers go and test after a snowfall or a warming event where you have a lot of runoff running into the waterways. And we, occasionally there are some storms that are kind of November, December, but we finish our baseline monitoring in very late October, early November. So it's just also hard for us to transition, plus, holidays. But in some cases there is some monitoring earlier than that. But January to April, the last few years has been really, I guess, the time when we have most of our snowfall. And so our volunteers go out and test for specific conductivity, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then if those levels are at a certain amount or a certain level of conductivity, then we collect water samples and send those off to the State Lab of Hygiene for analysis. And all of our data is put into the SWIMS database. So quickly, conductivity is essentially the measure of the water's ability to conduct an electrical charge. Conductivity meters, which we actually are using to test in our baseline water quality monitoring now as well. At that time, I think we weren't really testing for conductivity all year round, but I can talk about that in a second. But, they're fairly inexpensive meters, and they measure conductivity in microsiemens per centimeter. And we knew from a lot of really good work that USGS and others had done that there was a pretty, solid correlation, especially for our rivers, between chloride and conductance or conductivity levels. And so we could kind of estimate based on what the conductivity of the stream is, whether we were likely to hit one of those either chronic or acute chloride targets. So what we do is we have our volunteers test for conductivity, and when they are over a certain level of conductivity, and the numbers are down here, but that's when essentially we'll have volunteers collect samples, and we will send those to the state lab for testing. The chloride tests, I think right now, are around $25 each. So, where we have very low conductivity and it's very unlikely we'd have a lot of road salt, it's not really worth, maybe having those samples tested for chloride. But I would add, if there are those kind of intermediate levels of conductivity, our volunteers would have to go out for 4 days in a row and take samples. And for those who've done monitoring, that's not a light ask of anyone, whether you're paid to do this work or you're a volunteer. But so we have really incredible volunteers we've been able to work with since 2010 that have gone out in pretty harsh conditions and done this work. And all of this data is because of them. So we have some kind of summary graphs here just to share. And, I think not shocking to probably most people on this call, our chloride levels are the highest during the winter months. But what, might be a little bit interesting is that we do see exceedances in spring and also in even summer months, which is something that's increasingly of concern and does seem to be increasing in the last several years. And so, we look at when we have these exceedances, and generally if there's more than 2 exceedances, those rivers would be would be looked at to be listed as impaired under the state impaired waters list. And that just essentially puts them on a list that we know these streams are not meeting, what we think are healthy standards for chloride. And so this data is really looking, the top one is the percent of samples that we've had from 2002 to 2021 that have exceeded that chronic or slightly kind of intermediate range, I guess I could say, of chloride. And you can see, we've had some pretty large exceedances. Around 19% of our March samples are exceeding those what's considered safe. And then if you look at the below graph, which is the acute standard, which is the one that we really worry about as well, because it's these really high spikes of chloride. We're seeing some pretty large issues there as well in February and, January and March. But, it's very rare to see kind of very high levels in summer months that would meet that acute standard, but it's not zero in some cases. There's been some outliers, but certainly in that chronic or slightly lower level of concentration, we are seeing, quite a few violations in summer months. And I also just wanted to add that this data is looking at our data, so Milwaukee Riverkeeper volunteer data, but also some data from DNR and from MMSD in particular, and Ozaukee County as well. And Sewer Pack recently has also started testing for some salt and conductivity. So this is just that same thing, but looking overall at the percent of samples that have exceeded a chloride standards that are either chronic or acute. And again, you see those large spikes for the winter months, but, kind of some continuing issues lingering throughout the summer months. So, and this is looking at the data just as a pie chart. So, I think, well, if you're looking at all of the data, and I should add that this is also including summer data, right? So, so you wouldn't expect in summer to have a lot of exceedances. So, if you look at this pie chart, it might seem like maybe the problem isn't huge because around 91% of the time, our samples are meeting kind of what's considered a safe level of chloride. But, we are seeing really significant spikes. And increases as well in recent years. But, we do have a quite large, about 6% of samples that are exceeding the chronic toxicity and about 2% of the samples that are exceeding the acute toxicity. And this is just looking at that same time period and some of the really high spikes that have been seen in chloride concentration. So, and then the lines that you see down there, I think the blue is the chronic standard, and obviously the purple is the higher acute standard. But this just gives you a sense that, a lot of our urban rivers in particular are very, well over what's considered a safe level. And, a lot of them, the Kinnickinnic River is probably, certainly our most urban watershed and probably one of, if not the most urban watershed in the state of Wisconsin. But we have the Honey Creek, which I mentioned, which is a small creek draining the highway, the I-94, and Underwood Creek is a similar situation. But also other creeks like Indian Creek, which does get some impact from another interstate. But so basically, this is another graph, and this is looking a little bit differently, but this is looking at data. I think this is 2006 to 2019. But if you see green dots on this map, those are areas that we've tested at least, probably 2 or 3 times that have not had exceedances. So they're doing well. And that in our area correlates to the more rural kind of area of the watershed. And we have large parts of protected, the Kettle Moraine is up here, which is a wonderful state park and state forest. So, we're doing pretty well in the rural areas, but we have had some exceedances. You can see like some yellow dots and red dots in here. But, we've even, a lot of the urban areas, obviously, we're seeing a lot of exceedances. And the darker the number, like some of these data points mean that we have, like well over, 10 exceedances, in some cases, dozens of exceedances for some of those sites. And you'll see some dots outside of the watershed boundary because those correlate to Oak Creek and the Root River and some additional areas that we've tested over the years. But, we have a lot of creeks that are experiencing very high runoff from the highways, as I mentioned. And we also have a lot of small creeks that are, seemingly most impacted. The Milwaukee River in downtown is not exceeding any chloride standards right now. It's got incredible volume, less so this year. It's been a rough year rain-wise, but we're still talking about really large river that we're certainly seeing increases in chloride in a lot of locations, but still nothing that's reaching the kind of concerning levels. But we are seeing even small creeks, like there's I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not. Oh, where's my cursor? But there's a small creek here, the red dot that you see kind of midway up in the watershed is Uleo Creek, which is a really small creek in Ozaukee County. Which I wouldn't really have expected to have a lot of road salt runoff, but it is draining, Highway 60, which is a large kind of east-west road up in kind of the Grafton area. And so, a lot of those small creeks are seeing, pretty concerning levels of salt from runoff in the winter months. And then also we have concrete streams in our area, which I'm guessing maybe not everybody does, but those tend to be very highly impacted because they're also, in many cases, there's really no groundwater connection there. So, and when the water level gets very low, there's not really any groundwater kicking in and helping dilute that runoff. So those, creeks, not surprisingly, very impacted. So, one of the ways that we're looking at this as well is we've been, just trying to assess, what the condition of our rivers are. And, looking at, under the Clean Water Act, and we have water quality standards, there's kind of state standards for chloride, and there's also some federal levels that we previously used to use before we had state standards. But waterways that are exceeding the chloride standards can get put on this impaired waters list. And as I've mentioned, our monitors have played a really critical role in identifying waterways that are, have concerning or, potentially toxic chloride levels. And so, a lot of the work that we've done has led to impaired waters listings. And in general, when you have a water that's impaired for something, that will lead to a total maximum daily load, which is essentially, I like to tell people, it's like, it's basically a plan to put your watershed on a pollution diet. So it's looking at where the sources of pollutants are and how those pollutants can be ratcheted down over time until you get to that kind of safe range of what you'd like to see. In our watershed, we already have recently, I think as of 2018, total maximum daily loads for phosphorus, total suspended solids, and also bacteria. And, I think certainly chloride is likely to have some sort of a TMDL in the future, just because of the problem. And so we have found, I think with a combination of our monitoring and also some of the data from partners like MMSD, there's been over 117 different miles of rivers in our basin alone that have been listed as impaired for chloride. And so, I mentioned before we have 500 perennial stream miles. So, 117 miles out of 500 is a lot. And not shockingly, you can see on this map here to the left, the red lines are essentially all of the creeks, the river miles that have been listed in our area, and they're largely in the urban area. That other one is the Uleo Creek, which I just mentioned. And this is really just showing our water monitoring sites for, I think, actually the last 2 years. So we have, I think 2022 is kind of the more purple and 2021 is blue. But this is really on here because, we've done a lot of data in the urban area. USGS had done a lot of data before we even started. We know that we have problems in kind of the urban streams. And so we've really been putting most of our resources the last few years into really looking at the upper portions of our watershed and, looking at streams that we don't have any data for. And so we generally have a routine of going out for a few years. And I think the green ones are sites that we've monitored for 2 years that have had fairly low conductivity levels. And so we'll go out and test some of those sites. And if they seem to be fairly healthy, we'll move on to another site. And then, I think we very likely will maybe move back to some of those sites to check them in, some years' time. But as of now, we've tested them for a few years and they seem like they're doing pretty well. So this just kind of shows, I think, where we're putting most of our efforts now. And that has also been a bit of challenging in terms of needing to find new volunteers because we're moving around in different places. And as you can see, we really are desperate for volunteers in the North Branch, it looks like. So we need, more volunteers, certainly in the upper portions of our watershed. So we're going to transition a little bit away from monitoring to some other work that we've done. And so, I think knowing that we have an issue, we started around 2017 hosting annual snow and ice control workshops, largely for winter maintenance professionals. And those workshops, there's been 2 each year, one really looking at roads and one looking at parking lots and sidewalks, which was been more geared toward like facility managers, universities. But we've also had folks come from the Milwaukee County Zoo and different universities and the brewers, I think. And, like if you think of the largest parking lots, those are the folks that we want to get for those courses. And we've had really good success. We've trained hundreds and hundreds of folks. We've in the past contracted with Fortin Consulting, which is now Bolton and Mank, to do those classes. And, really just teaching, teaching the professionals, what the best practices are for this. There's been a huge transition in recent years from kind of granular to liquid de-icing and anti-icing, which is those lines that you see kind of on the road before the storm. That it's kind of like the oil in the frying pan that hopefully stops the snow and the ice from sticking. And so there's been a lot of new new practices, I should say. Technology is also, I think, improving somewhat. But, really just making sure that folks have the most up-to-date information about how to apply, the amount of product that is safe. We don't want we don't clearly want anyone to not be applying, enough product. We want to make sure that public safety is secured. But, I think in general, we're using way too much of salt and salt products. And, we're seeing that the river's telling us that it's getting in there. So, and as we all know, once the river is contaminated, once water is contaminated, once the salt is dissolved in water, there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. So the best thing that we can do is really try to stop a lot of the salt from getting into the river in the first place. So I wanted to mention we have a few dates coming up. We do have one for the roads workshop, which is geared more toward municipalities, which is full, but we do have some vacancies still for our August 23rd class. And so if folks are interested in that, they can find out more on our website or on the SaltWise website. And I think the website's down in the bottom of the slide here, but we do still have some vacancies. So we'd love to have more folks attend that. And so I kind of already touched on this. The classes really talk about, traditional de-icing and, and even just common, like at what temperature are these products useful, looking at how much needs to be applied for different square footages or lane miles of road, really looking at, the percentage of salinity and how to kind of switch over from maybe traditional de-icing practices to more of these liquid de-icers and anti-icers. And there's a lot of focus too on calibration. And I think, a lot of municipalities and others, I think that's just such a key part of this that's often, not really paid attention to, but making sure that how much you're actually applying on the road. And, I think all of these practices that clearly there's huge potential for reductions of salt. And so that means a lot less of this runoff also getting into the waterways and a huge cost savings as well. So in addition to kind of those public, workshops that we have also been just trying to do a lot of public outreach and, raising awareness by doing presentations. We have flyers and door hangs that we put on doors. If we have a lot of folks that are reporting to us now where they see buildings that have maybe too much salt. And so we'll go and hang some hangs on problem businesses or homes in some cases. Just trying to get more information out there about road salt and its impacts. And one side of the door hangs has, these are the impacts from salt, and the other, has common, the shovel early and often. You only need a coffee mug, to de-ice about a 20-foot driveway or 10 sidewalk squares. Just really basic information that people can use to hopefully minimize their use of salt. We've also started in the last few years developing social media toolkits for municipalities, and we've disseminated those to about a half a dozen or so communities that we work with closely, and that also where we're starting to see some of these impairments, and really making sure that they have information that they can use to send out in social media, that they can send out. Also with, we worked with one municipality creating like an insert for their water bills that talks a little bit about best management practices for homeowners. So if there are any municipalities on the call or folks that are interested in learning more about those resources, we'd love to share them with you. And clearly we also work with Saltwise that's doing a lot of, really amazing outreach work and trainings and calibration kind of clinics. And so I think we're all also just trying to leverage the fact that we can do a lot of these trainings digitally now. Certainly during the pandemic years, I think we were just making all of our trainings available to basically anybody who wanted to, to come in and listen. We have transitioned back to some in-person trainings as well, but I think, with all the different partners in the state that are working on this issue, that's just a really great resource where, we can leverage all of this work and hopefully reach the greatest audience possible. And so I know that's something that we're all working to try to do. So just kind of quickly, a little bit about policy and kind of management recommendations. I guess what are we doing with all of this data that we're collecting? And I think, certainly we're using it for, I think targeting outreach and education. We've also been incorporating it in a lot of what they're called 9 key element plans, but they're essentially watershed plans that have been worked on they're being worked on kind of all over the place. But for example, this is a graph of one that's in the Menominee 9 key element plan. And it's really just looking at, the impairments and that watershed. And so I think we're kind of using the data to document and then also queuing up a lot of, policy changes that are needed and different management changes that are needed to deal with the issue. So that it is certainly a big issue in the Menominee and the Kinnickinnic watersheds as well. We've also been really involved, working with Sewer Pack, on one of their technical committees. And I think Laura spoke at another one of these sessions or might be speaking, but they're doing a really interesting look at, chloride and rivers and lakes and kind of surface water, groundwater interactions. And I think we're getting a lot of really interesting information. They've had more continuous equipment out that's doing testing on a more regular basis. And so we're getting a little bit more information about what's happening out there. And I know they're also doing a lot of research on kind of state-of-the-art practices for de-icing and doing a lot of consultation with municipalities and counties and DOT and trying to figure out, what we should all be doing to try to address this problem. And I think certainly it's a huge issue for our waterways, but it's also, getting into lakes that are drinking water supplies. It's getting certainly into Lake Michigan, which is our drinking water supply. And there are folks, at the School of Freshwater Sciences that are looking at, chloride kind of levels in the lake. But we know, even like in Madison, for example, that, there are wells that are being contaminated. And again, once this water gets into the surface water or the groundwater, very difficult to deal with it. So we really need to do a lot better job preventing it, getting into the waters in the first place. I think one of the interesting things is going to be trying to get a better handle of, why are we seeing these exceedances in the summer months? I think certainly, a lot of that salt product could be just kind of at the bottom of the river with, the phosphorus and the nutrients and any other pollutants that might be down there. But I think there's a concern that potentially, a lot of this contamination in the summer months could be coming from that groundwater that's potentially contaminated, that's kind of kicking in those summer months. And so I think we're really trying to figure out what's going on there and whether, like practices like green infrastructure, which I think is a best practice for all pollutants, really trying to get more water to infiltrate, less water to run off is always, really important for improving water quality. But, the green infrastructure could be playing a role too in infiltrating some of that chloride to the groundwater. So that's something we really need to better understand and design for. And I think certainly there's a lot of questions about a TMDL I think TMDLs are a policy tool, and there's some regulatory element of them. But also this is a problem that has not easy solutions or cheap solutions in a lot of ways. But I think we certainly could benefit by having a better sense of and I think once we have some of this sewer pack report is done, I think there might be the right information and data and tools brought together to be able to create more of a regional or watershed plan on what should be our priorities and what work should we do, and what work should we be promoting as far as changing best management practices, changing products that are used, changing application rates, all of that type of information. So I think, that is something that, I think might be coming down the road for a lot of different watersheds. I know certainly in our area as well, highway expansion continues to be something that we're all living with, and I'm guessing in many other places. But, we're talking about increasing, impervious surface in some cases, by 40, 50 acres of pavement, which means more salt and more runoff going into, like I-94, for example. A lot of that runoff will be going right into the Menominee, where we're already seeing pretty significant toxicity levels. So, these are things that we need to look at all levels. Like, how can we do a better job, filtering highway runoff, making sure that we're not just, sending all this runoff where it's going to harm our creeks and harm our fish and harm our people that are potentially eating the fish. So, these are all things that I think, I think we're continuing to educate ourselves on and trying to get better. And I think certainly, we need the help of many, many people and smart minds to figure this out, because, a lot of the road salt, de-icing, so to speak, hasn't changed in decades, right? So there's been like slow changes, but we need to really maybe start thinking bigger picture about how we can, how we can do a better job with being safe on the roads in the winter. So just one quick note at the end here. So, one barrier to dealing with this issue often, and I would say, giving props to a lot of municipalities that have, I think gone to the liquid de-icing, that are taking this more seriously. They're calibrating their machines, they're doing a better job, around salt storage. They have a lot of those municipalities have significantly reduced their salt application, and, they've saved a lot of money in the process, and in some cases have been able to put that money into better equipment. But, one of the barriers on the private side in particular has been that a lot of applicators get paid every time they go out, and there's a incentive, maybe a perverse incentive, to go out and apply road salt even in conditions where we know, it's not going to work because it's too cold and they're not using the right products, or there's already a lot of salt already on the parking lot and they're applying more. I think we've all seen that during the winter months. And, a lot of it is more not really based on any science or best practice around making sure that an area is safe for us and for our cars and people walking, pedestrians. It's really more focused on, we want to make sure that people see salt here so that if they slip and fall, we're not sued. There isn't litigation. And so that has been a barrier to a lot of, and we've heard this from a lot of applicators that have come through our road salt workshops over the years. And so there is a new bill that's been introduced, and it's passed out of committee, both in our Senate and Assembly in Wisconsin. And the bill numbers are up here. It's SB 52 and AB 61. But really the purpose of those bills is to have a voluntary program for folks that are going through these types of educational programs to be, essentially certified as going through a program to learn how to do sustainable, de-icing. And if they go through that program and they are, they've been taught essentially to use the right amount of product and to apply these things, safely, that they would have essentially a liability shield from litigation. And, this has passed in other states. And I know there's been some challenges having it passed in Minnesota, which is just to our west here. But they also have been a lot of active efforts around this. But it is something that I think would really help, because it would say, a lot of people, a lot of these applicators know they're putting too much down, and I think they want to do the right thing, but there's like this concern from their clients, right, that they need to be applying more. So I think this would give some sort of assurance to folks that go through a program like the ones that we run, that the ones that Saltwise runs. And I think there's still, some details that would need to be hammered out, but essentially, that have gone through a reputable training program, that they would have some, a shield to liability. And that would really hopefully help address these issues that are barriers. And so we will say that it has gone out of both committees. Both bills are eligible to come to the floor for a vote. There's currently a recess right now, but we're really hoping that those bills could be advanced to the floor of the Senate and the Assembly and be voted on, in September, October, when the legislature comes back into session. So certainly, if there are folks on the call that this resonates with you, we'd really appreciate you reaching out to your Assembly folks, reaching out to your state senators, and urging them to pass this legislation, but certainly to get it out on the floor for a vote. And so I think it is something that is something concrete that we can do from the policy perspective that could really help with this. The other thing that I think I didn't put on here, but I'll just mention quickly, is I know there's a lot of other states too that are working on essentially labeling legislation. So if you go and try to buy some road salt, which we might be doing in a couple months here, it's often really hard to even be a good consumer because you don't know what's in the products. And we've heard that even from a lot of the applicators, they have the same issues because they go through our classes or, go through a Saltwise class, and they want to use different chemicals that they know would be more active at lower temperatures, like under 15 degrees. And it's hard to know what's in these products because some of these products could be still 90% rock salt, sodium chloride, with a little tiny bit of this other chemical put in. And because there's like a proprietary element to these products, they don't always know what they're buying either. And so there's a level of discomfort there clearly. And then a level of, well, they're going to have to try this to see if it works. And it's been difficult for even, professionals to get the information they need about these products. And even, folks that buy these products have tried to get information and it's difficult for them. So essentially, just a simple bill that would essentially require there to be some, disclosure over what is actually in the products that you're buying here. And I think that would really help applicators a lot as well. So with that, I have rambled on for 40 minutes and talked about a lot of different things. I'd really like to thank Saltwise for having us and for all the great work that they do. And thanks to everybody who's attended today. And I think with that, we're open for any kind of questions that people might have.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. If you want, I'm gonna stop your sharing there. So we're both up on the screen.
Perfect.
That's awesome. And I definitely appreciate the plug for our legislation. As you were talking, I shared a few links in the chat for folks. And yeah, I would just draw everyone's attention to that. If you're interested in reach out to legislators, I've got a link to a template letter. I also put in a couple of resources that would give people more background on the groundwater recharge, the idea that Cheryl went over, that we are recharging in the summer our streams with pre-salted water because the groundwater is salty. So Charlie Paradise spoke on that during Salt Awareness Week in January. And then I think the other link I put in there was from a webinar a couple of years ago. I would encourage people to go to Bill Hintz's portion of that because he really dives into the impacts of salt on freshwater organisms. And one thing that I think is sometimes missed is we talk about that number of 395 being a chronic toxicity level, but it's pretty false. It's not actually like biologically protective. And the way that I kind of think about that myself, and I'm going to try to explain it, is that's a lab value. So it's like taking an organism, putting them in a beaker in the lab or, an aquarium, and then slowly raising the salt levels and seeing when they are stressed out, when they're impacted, when they're dying. But when we look at what's actually happening, if that little critter is swimming in a stream that's getting increasingly salted while it is still needing to find food and run away from predators or swim away from predators, right? And deal with temperature changes and deal with other pollutants in the water, we see impacts at 50 milligrams per liter. So just that idea, like if, you're sitting in a recliner and perfect temperature, everything all around you, people are bringing you food, you could maybe be sipping some water that's pretty salty. But if you're expected to, go on a run and chase after your kids and find food and cook food and do all those things and be drinking saltier water, like, it's going to impact you a lot sooner. So that kind of multiple stressor
Yeah, no,
approach or consideration. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, I know it's hard. And I think, a lot of those numbers were really developed as part of the state regulations, I think, to flag, those creeks that are in crisis, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to be in crisis, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, so just know there are a few resources in there. We did, Cheryl, have a question already that came in, and I'm definitely encourage people to put more questions out there, and I'll try to check my email as well right now. Let me go back. So Joseph had a question, said that work has shown that potash fertilizers can be a major source of chloride to surface and groundwater in agricultural areas. Has Riverkeeper considered conducting trainings on best practices for the use of this?
That's a really good point. We did do a couple years ago, we did a kind of a lawn fertilizer workshop with Midwest Grows Green, which is another nonprofit, I think out of Chicago, that looked a little bit about that. And it was really geared toward folks that did more like golf course management and, larger turf management for universities and things like that. Less than, wasn't really a training for farmers per se. But we definitely have done those trainings in the past. And I agree. It's like something we need to continue to do. The other thing I didn't really mention about, the impaired waters element piece of it is, technically under the Clean Water Act, if you have a water that's impaired, for example, for chloride, that should give some protection to that stream, that there shouldn't be any new or increased discharges of salt into the water. And when you're talking about stormwater, obviously that's hard to manage. But we do have, in our basin, we have permitted discharges and at least a dozen, maybe more than that. I'd have to actually go and look at the exact number, but essentially, food manufacturers, cheese manufacturers often have permits also to discharge salt, which is another source of salt to the waterway. So in some cases, if there were new companies or any existing companies wanted to increase the salt discharge, DNR would control that ideally through permitting. There's also a lot of salt. I didn't really talk about it today, and Allison's more well-versed on this, but like well softeners are clearly a huge source of salt to the environment as well. And we do have, about, I think around 1/3 of our watershed people are on well and septic. So that is certainly another big source potentially of salt getting into our rivers as well through private wells. And so that is something too that I think there's a huge need for education on.
Mm-hmm. And even people who are on municipal water in areas where water is harder, right? So in Milwaukee, you guys are drinking the lake. So really people don't need to be softening that water. But that's not true, right? Across the state, definitely in the Madison area where I'm at, there are a lot of home softeners. And I think part of the issue there is it's hard, right? To make change, right? For anybody to make change. And I think we see a lot more, I would say low hanging fruit when working with municipalities, right? Around road salt, because it's really a win-win if they're over salting and they could bring that down, like that's saving them financially. And sometimes it's helping them provide a higher level of service, and it's reducing the water or the salt going into our water. When we start looking at people who have a home water softener and trying to convince them that this should move to the top of their priority list, spending money to do something that they don't see the immediate benefit of. I mean, maybe, they're ideally bringing fewer bags of salt down into their basement. But that's a lot harder to sell.
Oops, sorry. I was just going to say there's been some interesting, we've had a few communities here that have had Great Lakes diversions. So basically they were on wells and then they converted to, Lake Michigan water. And, I think like New Berlin, for example, is one, and Waukesha, is going to start a new diversion in the fall. It's looking like, but, we've seen in New Berlin that, a lot of, and I think Menominee Falls too had a small diversion, at one point in time, but, folks that now have lake water and they don't really need to use these softeners at all are still using them because there's this like, again, to Allison's point, there's this change. They've always used them. They feel like they need to keep using them, or they like the softer water. So, there's definitely a huge, need for education there. But I think with like this Waukesha diversion, that'll be an interesting thing to see, if there can be some really targeted education and trying to reduce the use of softeners and see if there can be an impact.
And I do know that the city of Waukesha's wastewater treatment plant has been doing a lot of that outreach already to try to get people to at least take their water softeners and reset them so that they're not, because the water softeners right now have this idea that they're bringing in water that's really hard. And so they're set to remove a lot of, or to try to remove a lot of these hardness ions, right? The calcium and magnesium, and therefore they're going to regenerate fairly frequently. Now that they're bringing in like Michigan water, which has a hardness that's maybe like a third of what they're used to, those softeners are still thinking they need to be in this overdrive mode. They're going to be, just like pumping out way more salt than is needed to pull out the hardness. So I think the wastewater treatment plant in Waukesha is telling people you got to reset your water softeners. But again, that's, making a time to have someone come into your home and go down to your basement and do this thing. And and ideally for me, I would say, what if we just tell people, turn it off, unplug it, like stop putting salt in it. People in Milwaukee are doing just fine. Their pipes are doing just fine without water softeners. Like you're now using the same water they are. You don't need to remove the little bit of calcium and magnesium that's in there. It's not doing you any harm, and it's relatively harmless to appliances because there's such a small level of it now.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think we maybe had another question. Gmail. I want to double check here the chat, see if there are any other questions that have come in. Don't see any right now. So just give it a second. But yeah, Cheryl, thank you so much for joining. And everybody, if you were able to watch this live, but you've got colleagues or friends, family you'd want to share it with, this link will continue to work, and you can watch the webinar. It'll be archived forever. So, well, don't wait for forever. Maybe go on next week or the week after, but yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, for coming on, and thank you for the work that you do year round.
Thanks so much for having us.
Glad that we are colleagues here in this. So you take care and tell Katie and everybody hi for me.
Will do.
Okay.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.